Hello and welcome back to another episode of Writing Thoughts with me, your local Komodo dragon that thinks she can write. For this week, I am once again rambling about what I have come to learn about another piece of borderline cliché writing advice. Show, don't tell. For the writers out there among my audience of birds, lizards, and humans, this is perhaps the writing advice that you have heard most often. Or if not, it is among the ones you hear a lot. Every book on writing, from ones that focus on weaving great novels to ones that help break down the hidden formulas used in screenwriting, will likely tell readers at least once to show, don't tell. And there's a good reason for that. Showing the reader or audience is better and more immersive than telling. When a horror narrative points out the sound of a howling wolf too deep and guttural to be natural, or how the characters are sure the shadow they're seeing stalking them is too big to be an ordinary wolf, it feels more immersive than just flat out telling them they're being hunted by a werewolf. The use of evocative detail and sensory immersion pulls them in and makes the narrative more engaging. I learned this lesson early on during the days I still wrote fanfiction, and it is one that I try to adhere to whenever I can because it's good, solid advice. But like all writing advice, it is not absolute. Writers don't often deal with absolutes, I find. We're not Sith. Or Jedi, for that matter. And that means sometimes, there will be points in the plot or parts of a narrative where you are better off telling the reader rather than showing them. But that will then bring up what is probably an obvious question. When is a writer supposed to tell, rather than show? Some will tell you I am wrong and that there is absolutely never a time to resort to just telling the reader, as opposed to showing them. However, if you care to listen to my opinion on the matter, I find that there are situations where the telling is better than the showing. One example of it that I confess is probably rare and comes from an earlier time when expectations of written fiction were different is from the Joseph Conrad novel Lord Jim. Early on, it tells us what the title character is like and makes very clear statements on his demeanor and what is arguably his defining character flaw. In this instance and in others like it, the reader is told this information rather than shown through narration or scene because it provides context. Without going into spoilers for the rest of the novel, I think that Lord Jim is harder to understand and less engaging if we are not told right away about Jim himself. It is in being told what to expect of him that we are able to better appreciate and connect with what happens. And, I think, it makes the emotional payoff of the novel that much stronger. In other words, sometimes you tell the reader something because it makes what comes later more meaningful or have more impact. Another instance when you might want to tell instead of show is if you don't want people to get any ideas. Or if you don't want them trying things at home. For example, if you have a scene where someone is making an improvised explosive, you absolutely do not want to show the step-by-step of that in your narration. You want to tell the reader the device is being built, but you don't want to show them how. You can probably include a few details here and there that are safe for public consumption or are just impossible, or you might focus on why it's being made or what the bomb maker is feeling during the process. Or have it be a background detail and the focus of the scene is a conversation as he works. But you absolutely do not want to show the bomb being made and instead you tell them it's being worked on or that it's ready. This is less about writing quality than it is just being mindful of people. It's no different than the production behind the TV show Mecha-Author not showing all the things that go into making his famous improvised contraptions. They revealed just enough that the audience had a solid grasp of what he was building and that it could work, but not enough that anyone who tried at home would be able to replicate it. Sometimes, showing would slow things down. If that isn't what you want to happen in a given scene, telling is one option to keep the pace going. In my experience, this is something that works best in an action sequence like a fight scene or chase. You don't always want to get bogged down in the gritty details of every flurry or exchange once you've established how each participant in the action sequence moves and fights. If the physicality has been established, I think you can safely mix short and choppy sentences with a little telling to get you through it. You don't need to narrate a fight punch for punch when quick, one sentence telling can do the job and convey the pace you want. Sometimes you also want to resort to telling to avoid slowing the pace down if a detail needs to be mentioned, but the character doesn't think it's important. I like this trick because it can serve two purposes. First, it can plant some subtle foreshadowing that wouldn't come across as such because of how little time you spent on the telling. Second, it can be characterization, revealing to the reader something about how the prospective character sees the world without having to spell it out. Showing by telling, in a roundabout sort of way. In a related way, you can probably get away with telling the small details if they're not the focus of the scene. One great example of this is in one of the chapters in one of the novels of Douglas Adams for the increasingly misnamed Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy trilogy. There's one chapter that consists of just one sentence telling us that a flight is now boarding. That's it. Rather than showing us the whole process of the characters getting aboard, Adams just tells us the flight is boarding and we are left to fill in the gaps. It's short, clear, and it works because it gets the point of the scene across with as few words as possible. The reader needed to know Arthur Dent got on the flight, but we didn't need it shown to us. So Adams told us instead. If you write cosmic horror or psychological horror, you might also want to resort to telling instead of showing in specific instances. Namely, when the effects are more important than the causes. If your character comes face to face with an eldritch abomination that violates reality with such squamous and untenable force that mere mortal minds snap in its presence, you are likely better off telling readers that's what's happening, rather than trying to show it. The effect of them going irrevocably and supernaturally mad is more important and should be what you show in narrative, while the cause and process you can relegate to being told. At least, that's how I see things because I think it's close to impossible to convey the process of going supernaturally mad convincingly, but we're all loosely familiar with what it's supposed to look like once you've been there. I say close to impossible because I've read authors that have come very close to showing it convincingly, but I've yet to read one that I found believable. Now, I must reiterate that when in doubt, default to showing over telling. However, writing is about what works best, and if what works best is telling, then by all means, do that. Just that I think you should be very careful in considering when telling is the best way or if you should try to show things in a different way instead. Before I go into the customary closing call asking you to like and subscribe and comment, or pointlessly asking you to look in the description and buy my novels, I do have a somewhat related tangent I want to wander off into. We call it storytelling. But we emphasize showing and not telling. Shouldn't it then be story showing? Is the need to show a story something recent, while telling was once the way things are done? Am I overthinking this? I probably am. In any case, that has been my rambling of not writing advice for this week. If you agree with me, leave a like. If you disagree with me, click the dislike button. Or leave a comment showing me how wrong I am. Also, do consider subscribing and sharing with your friends so I can pretend to have an audience. And do check the links in the description for my novels. They're not overly long and I think they're decently written, somewhat unorthodox fantasy novels. Check them out, you might like them. See you next week.